You wake up and before you have made a single conscious decision, 12 companies have already tried to shape one for you. The toothpaste on your sink, the coffee you reach for without thinking, the brand of phone in your hand, chosen not because you compared the specifications, but because of a feeling somebody installed in you years ago, one you never agreed to and can barely remember receiving. You believe you are choosing. But what if the choosing itself was designed? And what if the person who designed it figured out how to do this almost exactly 100 years ago, using a technique borrowed from his own uncle's most controversial ideas? This is the story of how marketing stopped selling products and started selling identities. And once you see how it happened, you will notice it everywhere for the rest of your life. Start at the beginning of the 20th century, before marketing was marketing. Advertising in its earliest form was almost embarrassingly literal. A poster for soap said, "The soap cleans well." A poster for tobacco said, "The tobacco tastes good." The pitch was the product. Nobody was selling a feeling. Nobody needed to. Markets were smaller, competition was thinner, and simply informing people that a product existed was often enough to sell it. Then, in the 1920s, a man named Edward Bernays changed the entire logic of persuasion. Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he had read his uncle's theories about the unconscious mind. The idea that human behavior is driven not by rational thought, but by hidden desires, fears, and drives buried beneath conscious awareness. Bernays asked a question nobody in advertising had seriously asked before. What if you stopped trying to persuade the rational mind and started speaking directly to the unconscious one? His most famous experiment remains one of the most audacious manipulations in the history of American commerce. In the 1920s, cigarette companies faced a problem. Roughly half the population, women, largely did not smoke in public because it was considered socially inappropriate. Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company to fix this. He did not run an advertisement that said cigarettes taste good. Instead, he staged a public event during the 1929 Easter Parade in New York City, in which a group of young women, at his direction, lit cigarettes in public and held them aloft. He had quietly primed newspaper photographers in advance to be there. He called the cigarettes torches of freedom. The framing was not about tobacco at all. It was about a woman's right to publicly claim a freedom that men already had. Overnight, smoking in public became, for a segment of American women, an act of liberation rather than an act of vice. Sales among women rose substantially in the years that followed. Bernays had not changed the product. He had changed what the product meant. That is the moment marketing stopped being about goods and started being about meaning. Bernays called his approach the engineering of consent, and he was remarkably candid about what he believed he was doing. In his own writing, he argued that the conscious manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses was a legitimate and necessary function in a democratic society. Because, in his view, the public's decisions were already being shaped by unseen forces, and someone competent needed to do the shaping deliberately rather than leave it to chance. Whether or not you find that justification comfortable, it reveals something important. The people who built modern marketing were not naive about what they were doing. They understood from the very beginning that they were not appealing to logic. They were appealing to identity, fear, belonging, and desire. The same unconscious material Freud had spent his career mapping. For decades, this remained mostly hidden from the public. Then, in 1957, a journalist named Vance Packard published a book that tore the curtain back. It was called The Hidden Persuaders, and it exposed the growing use of psychological research, including so-called motivational research, drawing on Freudian theory. By advertising agencies trying to influence buying decisions, people were not consciously aware were being influenced. Packard described techniques used to associate products with subconscious anxieties and desires. Cars sold not on horsepower but on virility. Cleaning products sold not on efficacy but on a housewife's guilt. Cigarettes sold not on flavor but on rebellion and independence. The book became a bestseller and briefly caused a public backlash against the advertising industry. But the backlash did not stop the practice. It simply made the practice more careful about hiding itself. Here's the counterintuitive part of the story, the part that most people miss entirely. The single most effective marketing technique of the 20th century was not invented by an advertising agency at all. It came from a psychologist studying dogs. Ivan Pavlov discovered that if you consistently pair a neutral stimulus, a bell, with something that naturally produces a response, food, the neutral stimulus alone will eventually produce that response on its own. The bell did nothing chemically to the dog, but after enough repetition, the bell alone made the dog salivate. This is called classical conditioning, and it is arguably the single most important discovery in the entire history of persuasion, because it explains something that should deeply unsettle you. Emotional response can be transferred onto an object that has nothing intrinsically to do with that emotion purely through repeated pairing. Now think about what a 30-second commercial actually does. It pairs a product, a car, a soda, a phone, with music that makes you feel something, faces that look happy, imagery associated with freedom or love or nostalgia, repeated dozens or hundreds of times across your lifetime. The product itself is chemically and functionally unrelated to happiness. A can of soda cannot make you feel young. A car cannot make you feel free. But after thousands of repeated pairings, your brain does the same thing Pavlov's dog did. It stops distinguishing between the neutral object and the emotional response that was paired with it. You do not choose the soda because you evaluated its properties. You choose it because somewhere in your nervous system, a bell has been ringing since childhood. The psychologist John B. Watson, one of the founders of behaviorism in American psychology, understood this connection explicitly. After a personal scandal ended his academic career in 1920, Watson did something almost nobody expects when they hear his name for the first time. He left the university entirely and went to work for an advertising agency, applying the exact conditioning principles from his laboratory research directly to commercial persuasion. Watson helped popularize techniques that are now standard in the industry, associating products with authority figures, creating manufactured anxieties that a product could then resolve, and appealing to status rather than utility. A scientist who had spent his career studying how to condition emotional responses in laboratory settings spent the second half of his career doing the exact same thing to an entire consuming public, and he was remarkably successful at it. This should reframe something for you. Marketing did not evolve from salesmanship, it evolved from psychology. The people who built the modern advertising industry were not charismatic salesmen guessing at what worked. They were, in many cases, trained scientists who understood the mechanics of the human nervous system and applied those mechanics deliberately at scale to an audience that had no idea it was the subject of an experiment. By the second half of the 20th century, this had become fully systematized. The researcher Robert Cialdini, decades later, would formally categorize the psychological principles that persuasion relies on: reciprocity, social proof, authority, scarcity, consistency, and liking, cataloging what marketers had already been using instinctively for generations into a coherent science with predictable, replicable effects. Scarcity messaging, only 3 left, limited time offer, works because your brain evolved in an environment where scarce resources genuinely meant competition and risk. And that ancient alarm still fires even when the limited time offer is a fiction invented by a marketing department an hour ago. Social proof, 9 out of 10 people prefer this, works because for most of human history, following the group was a reliable survival strategy. And your brain is not caught up to the fact that the group you are seeing might be an advertisement's own invention. None of these techniques require you to be foolish. They require you to be human. That is what makes them so effective and so difficult to defend against, even once you understand exactly how they work. Now think about where this leads in the world you actually live in. The techniques have not disappeared, they have become invisible by becoming ambient. You no longer experience an advertisement in the way people did in the 1950s, sitting through a clearly bounded commercial break. Today, the persuasion is woven into the content itself. A sponsored post that looks like a friend's recommendation, an algorithmic feed that learns your specific emotional triggers and serves you content engineered to hold your attention a few seconds longer. A brand identity built not around a product's function, but around a lifestyle you are invited to imagine yourself living. Bernays engineered public opinion through staged newspaper photographs. Today, the same fundamental technique, pairing identity and emotion with a product, runs continuously, automatically, personalized to you specifically, optimized in real time by systems more precise than Bernays could have imagined. And here's the final uncomfortable symmetry. Bernays believed the public could not be trusted to form its own opinions without expert guidance, so experts needed to quietly guide them. A century later, you now live inside a media environment built almost entirely on that same premise, except the guidance is no longer coming from a small number of visible experts. It comes from thousands of competing systems, each trying to condition a slightly different bell, each hoping that when it rings, something in you responds without you ever noticing you were listening. So the next time you feel a small, wordless pull toward a product, a flicker of desire you cannot fully explain, attached to a brand rather than a need, pause for a moment before you reach for your wallet. That feeling was not always there. It was built deliberately by people who understood exactly how the human mind responds to repetition, emotion, and belonging, using techniques first tested on dogs and first weaponized on a New York City sidewalk in 1929. You woke up this morning believing you were choosing. The truth is quieter and stranger than that. Long before you opened your eyes, the choosing had already begun.